Welcome to Nuclecast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The ANWA Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another great episode of Nuclecast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and today we've got a great guest. We're going to be talking about a topic we don't always talk about. That's, of course, space and sort of the future of space. And so to do that, we've got Major General Brook Leonard, who, like many Air Force officers, he started off as a fighter pilot and flew F-35s, and then he sort of started working on some space stuff, operationalizing space out at the Weapons Center at the Air Force Weapons School, and he's done some interesting things. He worked for Secretary James as her military assistant. Was a chief of staff at Space Command, when they were operationalizing that and creating a new one. He's done a lot of cool things that we're going to get to talk about as we, put a little bit more of a focus and an emphasis on space and how that's going to play an increasingly important role in the strategic environment and how we, the United States, prepare to fight or deter, of course, preferably, our adversaries, the Russians and the Chinese. So with that, Brooke, thanks for joining us on Nuclecast. It's good to have you.
Adam, great to be here. Look forward to the conversation today.
So you have a background in which you were the right guy at the right time to see and do a lot of the early things that led to the ultimate creation of, a space command, a new space force, and this idea that space is more than a supporting force, that it can be a warfighting force as well. Can you sort of talk us through maybe some of the history of how that happened and what happened, and then sort of, what led to it, and then where we've, the directions we've moved in, and, that sort of timeline?
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. I would kind of break it down into a tactical, operation, and strategic parts where, I don't know if I was the right guy at the right time, but I was definitely the guy that got asked to stick my toe in the water. Immediately, though, I realized that air as a domain, the high ground, if you will, was being superseded by space as the ultimate high ground, and quickly realized how important and how capable integrating air and space was. At the tactical level, I got to see it from a weapons perspective as we got into precision-guided munitions, understanding the GPS constellation, which back then wasn't fully fleshed out. And so we actually got reports on the health and well-being of the GPS satellites, and we would tell our system in the F-16 which satellites to ignore and which ones to pay attention to. And we would actually plan our deliveries around certain locations based on the constellation above us. And we would sometimes change our time on target because the constellation was more accurate at a certain time at a certain location. And so I got to teach all that, understand how to integrate that. And so that was really special. I spent a lot of time with the early space weapons officers out at the Air Force Weapons School. We initially integrated them into fighter wings to be able to have that cross flow between pilots and space officers. We then fleeted them up to our operations centers because we felt like that was a better place to put them, given the fact that space was delivering capabilities above and beyond just precision munitions, communications, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. And so we elevated them out of that. But in the early days, they were sitting right beside us, and we got to integrate them into large force exercises out on the ranges at the Nellis Test and Training Range, and quickly understood the incredible capabilities and the fact that even though a lot of space capabilities were highly classified, we needed to bring them down into the tactical and practical level. And so that was kind of my foray at the tactical level, if you will. Operationally, I saw that much later in my career as the chief of staff at U.S. Space Command, as U.S. Space Command was a geographic as well as a functional combatant command. And so we had area of responsibility at 100 kilometers and above. And so we had to interface with the other geographical combatant commands and understand how we would interface and how we would deliver capabilities, how threats, traveling across our boundary lines, how we would hand those off and cooperate. And so got to see really practically how we needed to integrate space on a daily basis, both pre-conflict and during conflict. As you mentioned, deterrence, incredibly important. And so we even worked with the State Department on the diplomatic side to gain allies, to start to generate a broader set of norms in how we kept space safe and secure. And so that was pretty cool to do that. And then at the strategic level, I was there with Secretary James as her senior military assistant, where we sought to get off of Russian rocket engines and develop our own launch capability that really could bring down the price per kilogram and the access that we see today. And so being on the ground level as we worked with SpaceX and some early engine companies to improve that and make it made in the U.S. Got to see that piece, and then also work through the debate on, do we stand up a separate Space Force? And back then, we decided for some really good reasons that it wasn't quite time. But when I was at Space Command, I got to see and have a front row seat when it was time. And I think it was very important that we do that. President Trump did that back in 2019. And we were actually late to the fight. The Chinese and Russians had already integrated space, stood up their space forces, and we were doing our version of that about 4 to 5 years after them. But it was time for us to do that. And the Space Force today is doing an incredible job of organizing, training, and equipping space warriors to feed that into joint forces. And so it was really neat. But along the way, I would tell you, not only does space provide an incredible amount of opportunity, it also provides vulnerabilities. And so being able to balance that is really important as we go forward.
So when you were the chief of staff at Space Command, you had to think about, as you were standing up a new command and you were going to operationalize space, and you had a lot of variables that you had to think through about what decisions you made, what decisions you didn't make, and why you made those decisions. Can you sort of walk us through that, sort of that logic, that give and take, that discussion that was going on at the time, and, help us sort of get in your mind and in the mind of the leadership?
Yeah, first of all, Adam, as we considered how to operationalize space, we had to think through how congested the environment really was. And then the other really big point was how to make sure that we could continue to use the domain for our advantages, and then obviously make sure the enemy could not do that themselves. And space had grown from, the orbits filled with, CIA satellites and military, and now we had commercial, and then all that had expanded, 20-fold and was quickly growing. And so how do we actually operate? How do we deter? How do we get ready for combat operations in the middle of commercial satellites, civil space exploration, the ISS, the fact that the Chinese had put up their own version of the ISS? And so we really started to reference a lot of things that we had done in the air domain, particularly in fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Iraq even more specifically. For an example, why we were fighting against ISIS, we had to make sure that the airways that were coming from Europe and going down into the southern parts of the Gulf were sustained. That was quite a revenue source for the Iraqi government, And so we had to run military operations alongside civilian air traffic. And so, having kind of pulled a piece of that playbook into space, we quickly realized that we needed to integrate our operations with what the others were doing. And it's very similar to westward expansion in the United States. The settlers went out with the cavalry, went out with the commercial, and they all had to integrate and survive together. But we had to have that mindset that we were there, but also there were a lot of other people there, and we had to get used to operating in confined spaces with multiple effects by one action, and just understand how to do that very carefully and very much coordinated. We actually have integrated a lot of the businesses into our command centers to where they understood what the threats were up in space, and then also just what space control looked like in terms of the space catalog, where debris was, where other satellites were, giving warning to them. And so that's how we started our coordination pieces. But we knew from the outset that we had to have that coordinated, and we also knew that we had to protect the domain and really on the diplomatic side start putting out information on how fragile the environment was to really encourage some international norms for the protection of those orbits that we hold critical for everyday life. And so that was kind of our mindset. We had some opportunities from previous conflicts. We haven't fought a war in space, but we had a lot of history that kind of rhymed with the present. And so we tried to use that. And we really just tried to spread out our coordination beyond just how do we coordinate with other militaries, but how do we coordinate with commercial and civil to include other international commercial and civil corporations.
So space is one of those domains where, as I think about, let's say, a future, World War III or a great power conflict, I don't think that China or Russia are the first strike is going to be a nuclear strike. I would submit that they're going to make us deaf, dumb, and blind through cyber and space first. And then if they can do that, then they're going to hope that Transcom can't push, goods and people, overseas. And then if they can do that, then they won't ever have to use a nuclear weapon. And so space is one of those kind of places where they can make us, deaf, dumb, and blind. Are you seeing sort of a different way that you think our adversaries will, attack us in space, be it kinetic or, non-kinetic, disruptive? How are you thinking as you think about, well, how could this future in which there might be conflict in space, what might it be? What are you thinking? How do you see space conflict developing?
Yeah, I think it's developing a lot more along what I would call Eastern methodologies and thoughts, more of the Sun Tzu versus maybe some more brute force thinking. We obviously have two adversaries that have two different mindsets, speaking of Russia and China. I think Russia understands more strength and power, and China is a lot more nuanced. Now, they both have, these capabilities, but China is looking to win before fighting. And so they are looking for that knockout blow before we really even realize we're under attack. And not only are they bringing in the capability to attack via cyber information, but also looking at economic capability and geography. They're buying up land next to our installations, but they're also trying to strike partnerships, particularly in South America, and they're putting in space surveillance capabilities in those locations. And it's important to leverage space. You got to have geography on the ground all over the globe. And so it's very interesting, but I do think that it's a lot even more broader than you speak of. And the sort of devastating out of the blue, blow from a nuclear weapon, I think is being replicated in much more subtle ways across a combination of geography, economics, cyber, and space. And that gives us opportunities as well. But I think our sort of Western methodologies, we're kind of the sleepy lion, if you will, that eventually gets woken up, and we build up forces in Kuwait and then push Saddam out of Kuwait and back into Iraq. I don't think we have that opportunity anymore because of the connected world, because of how space is connecting and bringing immediate effects across the globe. And so we need to have a mindset of fighting and irregular warfare, if you will, before the actual conflict begins, because I think we'll have very little time to either react to or counter a very devastating blow that combines a lot of those effects and a lot of those domains that we just mentioned.
Now, it's that time in the show where we have to take a quick break, so we'll do that, and then we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the AMLA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back, and we're talking to Major General Brook Leonard, and we're talking about our adversaries and sort of how the Russians and the Chinese think. Do you think that we have the right mindset, not only for the defense of our own space capabilities, because we're probably the most dependent nation on space as as sort of a multiplier effect for everything else we do, but do we have the right sort of offensive mindset that is effective in making the Russians say, "Not today, comrade, not today," or the Chinese
Right.
say, "Not today"?
Yeah, I think those not today thresholds are different across Russia and China. And I think that's one of the things we're struggling with. So you asked about our mindset. I think we're growing that mindset. We're not quite there yet. Yeah, just even understanding that we can't apply the same counter mindset or deterrence framework for Russia as we do for China is something that I think we're just now growing into. And it is different, and it needs to be particularized to your opponent. And the fact that we have two rising slash great powers, depending on where you fall on that debate, we now have a more complex way because we're always speaking to both audiences, but yet we need to speak in different ways to make sure it's effective. So I would say we're growing into that, if you will. The other piece and part, though, is the fact that, like I mentioned before, space connects so many things. And I think as Americans, we're very used to having two really big oceans and friendly neighbors to our north and south, and the homeland being threatened, and our capability to generate forces has never been threatened, but it's going to be. And we need to make sure we protect that. And so that's another mindset shift that I think we're slowly growing, that's very important. And then the last mindset shift is I think we have to be very vocal, as well as very capable, obviously, on both the defensive and offensive side. And we've been slow with that. I think China and Russia have both realized how offensive space capabilities and counter space capabilities are important. I think we're slowly, being able to say that word, that space is a warfighting domain, and that we have offensive space capabilities. Again, that mindset is growing, but we're about 4 to 5 years, if not more, behind Russia and China already admitting that, already organizing for that, already developing weapons for that, and not just experiments and R&D projects, but actually fielded capability that's integrated into exercises. And so those are kind of the three mindset areas that I think are important. And I would tell you that I think we're getting there. I'd like to see us get there a little bit faster.
And do you see within the decision making community, and so for the nuke world, the nuke world sort of understands and most of our listeners are going to come from the various nuclear tribes, whether they be the labs, the Air Force, the Navy. Um, and they sort of know the business that they're in and they know the destructive power of it. And I remember being back at the War College and, there was a few space zealots and, they were always like, these space guys, they're making a bigger deal out of space than it really is. And, they were writing about space. And have we gotten to a point where sort of the space zealots are now just the space guys? And are they still kind of the zealots who are preaching a future world that is still, it's like quantum computing, it'll be here anytime soon, or are we
Yeah.
there?
I think we're close. I think the big differential there is you can at least go back into old footage and see the destruction of actual nuclear weapons. It's, this generation hasn't necessarily lived it or, seen it firsthand. But again, we can go back in the archives and we can understand the incredible destructive power of nuclear weapons. And so I think that sort of changes the nuclear zealots into the folks that know their business. They're the professionals and they're the silent guardians, if you will. On the space side, like I said, we have not had a space war. We have not, seen one satellite debris hit another satellite and then that chain reaction and have an entire orbit wiped out. And so it's hard to imagine. And I think it's going to take a lot of time, short of an actually catastrophic effect, which I don't hope for or wish for. Uh, Obviously, that would really cage our brains and focus us on the capabilities and what we needed to do in space and what we shouldn't do in space. But I think it's just going to take a lot of time and a lot of imagination because, frankly, right now the whole world is incredibly dependent on space effects, and we don't even know how dependent we are on that. And that's because it's been managed, it's been organized, and it's been equipped in very powerful and incredible ways, and then commercialized and given to us, in our phones that we carry around with us and our watches and so forth. So I think we're very much uh, dependent on it, and we don't really realize how dependent we are just because we haven't had or seen the devastating or catastrophic effects of, you know, an actual war in space, quite frankly, where we have seen the delivery of nuclear weapons.
I mean, you mentioned this. You make me think of 2 points, and the first is the fact that we have these things that they fit in our pockets, and
Right.
we can talk to satellites with things that fit in our pockets. I mean, that's actually quite amazing that we can do that,
Oh,
and that
yeah.
we can then talk to a satellite and then talk to a person and look at him, on our little device, our magic device, and he can be like on the other side of the world and it's
Yeah.
instantaneous. It's really truly amazing that that's where we are with technology today, and it's ubiquitous. And like my kids, I took my daughter who's now 13, but a few years ago we went to the Eisenhower Library because we were crossing Kansas, and so I was like, we got to go to the Eisenhower Library, and in the Oval Office there was his phone, and I said, "Hey, Abby, what is that?" And she's like, "I have no idea what that is." And I'm like, "That's a phone." And she's like, "Well, how do you use it?" And it was a rotary phone. And I
Right.
explained to her how rotary phones work. And she's like, "There's no way that would work." And it's just, they don't have any sense of life without space. And they don't even,
Yeah,
they take for granted, what it is.
absolutely. That also brings up another kind of counterfactual point that I found very interesting that we explored when I was in Space Command was what if you assumed that both you and your adversary had complete communications and surveillance capabilities throughout the conflict? And so, we were looking at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and it was very interesting to see how the Ukrainians, adapted to Russian jamming, et cetera, and how, Starlink and a lot of different capabilities, they were able to maintain their communication capabilities against, an incredibly, um, against the Russians, who are incredibly good at counter comms. And we started thinking that, there could be a conflict where you cannot knock out your adversary's communications. They can't knock out yours. And you can also see what they're doing, and they can completely see what you're doing. And how does that change? Does deception go away? Or is it still important just to add fog and friction to their decision-making process? And how do you actually fight if your adversary can see exactly what you're doing all the time? Where's the element of surprise? And, as we look at the nature of war and the characteristics and our plans, how does that change things? And so it's a really cool conversation, because, like you just mentioned, that phone right there, I was looking at the other night. My wife was going to pick up one of our sons at school, and I had left my car there, and they were also going to pick that up. And I could follow my wife based on her cell phone signal. And then I was looking at an overlay of the parking lot on where she was. I knew where I parked, and the seniors at this high school had actually painted the parking spaces, and I could see that because the latest ISR from space had captured that, and I could tell her, hey, the car is 3 rows over and 2 slots down, and but that's available to everybody. And so it's very interesting to think of conflict, to where you're completely exposed, and so is your enemy in terms of what they're doing. And so how does that change things? So an interesting thought for sure.
Now, it's that time in the show where we like to bring out Bob the Genie. And as I rub my magic lamp, Bob grants all guests 3 wishes, so long as they have to do with the things we've discussed on the show. So no great wealth, no youth, but you can make wishes about space and all the space topics we've talked about. So with that, Brooke, what is your first wish?
I think my first wish is a deep understanding of how important space is, across the globe, down at the individual level.
And do if that's your wish, where do you think we are in terms of, like, is that like a small wish for Bob, or is that like a big task for Bob? Where are we on accomplishing that?
I think it's a big task because its space effects and capabilities have been delivered so seamlessly, and they're so embedded in everything we do. It can be scary. And so there's a psychological, mental side to it, but that awareness, I think, will help us understand how we need to protect the sanctity of space, but then also defend, our capability to be able to access and use space. So it's a big task. Yeah, I'm asking Bob to do a lot here.
So are you, for the new guys, we had shelters, we did drills in schools. We had lots of ways we sort of prepared the American public for nuclear conflict. Do we need something like that for space? I mean, do we need to have like emergencies where we make GPS go down for, like 5 minutes? Or, do we need something that sort of gives the American public a sense of what is lost if we had lose space?
I've thought long and hard about that in Space Command. That was one of our big things, was how do we educate people on the importance of space? And it almost was to the point where we couldn't do that because it would be too catastrophic. Like there was no way to sort of, even for a second, take away the space capabilities, because, just the timing signal alone helps encryption and commerce, banking transactions, the fact that I can swipe my credit card at the gas pump and, take money out of my account, that's all enabled by space. And so, can you imagine it, even for a second or, a little bit of time, we took that down. And so I think it's going to have to be something else. It's going to have to be education And it's going to have to be a prolonged campaign to do that because, again, the visceral effects of getting under your desk, like we used to do, I don't think it's an option for space because it's so embedded in what we do. That's really why it's, I think, a really hard wish to grant.
Okay, so wish number one was a hard one. How about wish number two?
Wish number two, I think, is also a hard one, and it's that we as Americans can understand how our adversary especially the Chinese, from an Eastern sort of way of thinking, are trying to win without fighting, short of a 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. And we have had a hard time, I think, as Americans, innovating and kind of turning the corner on new technologies or new mindsets, short of something very catastrophic. And so, my wish is that we can grow our simulation, modeling, exercising, and how we integrate across civil, commercial, and military, and be able to war game our way into understanding how lethal and dangerous a very nuanced and quiet and in the background approach the Chinese are applying. So that's my second wish, and probably no easier than the first.
And then how about your third wish, final wish?
Yeah, my third and final wish is to be able to break through the gravity well and access space on a very frequent basis, and to develop the technologies that allow us to go back and forth and really just reap the benefits. Now, it's going to come with the importance of securing that environment, just as we got out on the high seas and we had to protect against piracy. But we developed international rules and norms, and it's benefited everybody across the planet. It's increased our quality of life across the board. And so I hope for something that allows us to get in and out of the gravity well, very cheaply and easily, and really make space kind of our next big expansion, and not necessarily humans living in space. That'll be interesting if that's something that folks want to do, but the ability to go back and forth and take advantage of the incredible manufacturing benefits, just from a biopharma perspective, circuit boards, just what we can do in microgravity, as well as what we can do by understanding our planet and, communicating and connecting. That gravity well is still a booger and holding us back a little bit. And so I wish for something that would allow us to transit a little bit easier, similar to the rail lines, that headed out to the west as we expanded our great nation. So that's my third wish. Maybe a little bit easier than the other two.
Now, as we sort of wrap the show up, is there sort of a mic drop last thought you want the audience to walk away with?
Yeah, I would say that space is an incredible enabler, but it's also an Achilles heel, particularly when it comes to nuclear deterrence and the fact that our ISR, our PNT, missile warning, and comms are kind of all wrapped together. So let's understand that while there's incredible opportunities, there's also incredible dangers, and to have a really balanced mind on our approach.
All right. Brook Leonard, thanks for joining us on this episode of NucleCast.
Yeah, thanks, Adam.
And thanks to you, the listeners, and we'll see you next time.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Grunthal. Help us grow our followers by sharing it, and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast.